Hi, everyone. Wonderful that you could join us this afternoon. My name is Madeleine Thien. I'm a novelist and a professor here in the MFA program in fiction, and I'm so honored to host today's reading featuring Asian American alumni of our MFA program in creative writing and in honor of the events for our Hess Scholar in Residence, Lisa Lowe. The first thing I'd like to do is thank the sponsors of today's reading. That's the Brooklyn College MFA program in creative writing and the Asian American Writers Workshop. I've been asked to just briefly introduce each of the writers with a briefer bio, but to let you know that you can refer to the online program to learn more about our distinguished writers. And that link is available, I think, already in the chat. The readers will each read for 10 minutes, and we're going to have a lot of time for questions and conversation. So please note down your questions, and I will be able to have those in the chat and with the raise hand function and all of that. Okay, so I'm just going to cut to the chase. The order of the readers will be Jai Chakrabarti, then Cherry Lusai, and then Yun Wei. And I'll begin by introducing Jai. Jai Chakrabarti is the author of the novel A Play for the End of the World, right here, just published on September 7th, and also the forthcoming story collection, A Small Sacrifice for an Enormous Happiness. He received his MFA in fiction from Brooklyn College in 2013. Welcome, Jai.
Thank you so much, Madeleine, and thank you, Professor King and Professor Lowe. It's so lovely to be back with Brooklyn College. Although virtually, I still feel like I'm there in my old haunt. So I'm just going to read a little bit from my novel, and I'm going to start out by reading the author's note, which sets the historical context for this book. And then I'm going to read a little bit from a section that's early in the novel. So here's the author's note. On July 18th, 1942, weeks before the deportations to Treblinka, the Polish Jewish educator, medical doctor, and author Janusz Korczak staged a play at his orphanage in the Warsaw Ghetto. The performance was an adaptation of a Bengali play, Dakor, by Rabindranath Tagore. Dakor literally means the calling house. Nowadays, it's translated as the post office. Rabindranath Tagore wrote Dakor in a village in India in 1911. A couple of years later, W.B. Yeats produced an English version. The play was then translated into many languages, and eventually a Polish copy ended up in the hands of Janusz Korczak, known to his children as Pan Doktor. The play is about a dying child living through his imagination while quarantined. Pan Doktor chose to stage the play to help his orphans reimagine ghetto life and to prepare them for what was to come. So that's the historical context for this novel. And I'm going to read a section that's fairly early in the novel. And it's ostensibly about an escape from the train that is headed to Treblinka and is in the third person point of view with the protagonist Jarek. And it's more deeply about the fracture of memory and how we experience different versions of the same event when we are thinking about trauma, and how that remains with us even as we go through life. Sometime between living and dying, the train stopped. It was the moment Jarek remembered more than any other. 30 years, he hadn't grown himself another version. Some memories were like that, bolted and nailed to the mind's eye. You could try to change them, shape them into something they weren't, but you would always be the boy with trousers that reached his ankles, the boy with the tweed cap found by Misha and given special. And the train was stopped now. Who knows whether for a moment or for a longer time. and the guards were shouting now because he thought someone ahead had jumped. He was holding Chaim's hand, who he knew didn't have the heart to move an inch, and the heat had already burned, and he had already cried, and Pandukter could do nothing because he was just breathing. He thought jump, but the rifles had colored the air outside with smoke. Still, he could see it. The window was big enough not only for a cat, but also for him if only he jumped and squeezed through, except the train had started to move again. The screams had died down. The soldiers had stopped firing. He looked at Pandukter, and Pandukter winked the way he did whenever a mischief had been made. But no one was going to be told because love was that kind of secret keeping. The train had started moving again, but he saw the sun through the window that was big enough just for him. And what spirit launched his body? What ghost slid him forward? Because it was not his 9-year-old bones that did. Still, it happened. He jumped on Chaim's shoulders. He pulled himself up. He went headfirst, and someone he'd never know who pushed his body through the gap. He landed so softly on the sloping hill and rolled so quietly down the field filled with sharp rocks, holding his pain that no soldier heard. For a while, he watched the train pass, expecting others to have followed, but no one else did. Not another soul had jumped on another boy's shoulders and been pushed into the fields. Was he simply the skinniest, the fastest, or just the most daring of them in that car, the one most willing to leave the others? Now he was alone again in the field of damp and moss. He heard water nearby, and he thought of Pandukter's face, so much hope, his knees bloody with it, his left wrist bruised, dark, so much hope in the wet grass under his palms, that when the train gnarled away, the old trees called, and he crawled his way from the light of the sun into the light of the trees. Sometime between living and dying, the train stopped. It was the moment he remembered more than any other. 30 years, he hadn't grown himself another version. He heard the first gunshot, saw the 2 officers turn away, rushed upon Pandukter's side, who was breathing so heavily his whole chest heaved with the effort. Yarick pointed to the window, whispered, "We can squeeze through that." Pandukter said, "Not all of us can." He looked again, not the darkness, but the light of the waiting. He couldn't tell if Pandukter would be afraid. Still, it happened. With one held breath, he jumped on Chaim's shoulders and squeezed through. He landed so softly on the sloping hill and rolled so quietly down the field filled with sharp rocks, holding his pain that no one heard. Sometime between living and dying, it was the moment. 30 years, he hadn't grown himself another. Some memories were like that, as stiff as Madame Steffa, who refused to sit the whole time she stood. She guarded the window. On the back of the first gunshot, he bolted, but her legs were like a guillotine. How could he pass through? "If we all don't go, you don't go," she said, as if he should have known. He remained by her knees, "To love your brother," but he had not stolen. He had not thieved. Sometime between living, dying, it was the moment, 30 years, he hadn't, when Pandukter removed his spectacles and lolled. "Not all of us can, but you can." Pandukter was the one who lifted him up, and Yarick squeezed through the back of the first gunshot, crawled his way from the light of the sun into the light of the trees, his knees bloody with the memory of his old teacher with no spectacles, winking at that too bright light. For he had been chosen. He had been reborn. Thank you. And so excited to hear the other readers today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jai. It's a haunting reading. I find myself very much in that in between, between living and dying. I have so many questions to ask you, but I'll move on to Cherry Liu. Cherry Liu Tsai is a writer, playwright, and performer originally from the Philippines, who earned her MFA in playwriting from Brooklyn College in 2019. Welcome, Terry Lou. I'm so glad you could be with us.
Thank you, Maddie. And thank you again to Professor King for inviting me to participate in this reading today. I thought about this a lot, like what would I read? Because I graduated from the playwriting program, but I also studied with Mac Wellman, who had retired actually the year that I graduated. So one of the things I learned from Mac was never to be afraid of experimentation, never to fear form, and to play with genre, you know? And so I kind of did that. And I do work on plays, but lately, since graduating, I've been playing around more with fiction because it was a genre that I did like before. So I'm going to read some selections from some of the fiction I've been working on. And I just found out that we have a little bit more time, so I might read 3 selections, but feel free to stop me if it's too long. Okay, so this first one is called Superman. It's a flash fiction that I just wrote recently. Anatomically speaking, you have a bulb of flesh hanging in the middle of your pelvic area like a piece of horseshoe pastry crowned by a donut stick. When you were 18, you named your pastry Superman because it flew like a bird and angled itself like a plane, and you remembered what people in the old films and TV shows said when they talked about Superman. It's a bird, it's a plane, it's... You wanted to think about how other people thought of your horseshoe pastry flesh. Soft jelly to granite in a single touch in a matter of seconds. It didn't matter if it's the painted nails of nervous girls too high from fear on a dare. You even liked it when strange older men brushed against you in bathrooms trying to see if you would follow them to one of the stalls. It was just the thrill and the sensation felt like life. Real, honest to goodness life. It was potential to turn you on, but you never dared to say a word. In real life, in actual real life, the life you lived eating bags of Fuego Takis from the deli and Arizona iced tea. Who were you kidding when you couldn't even be Clark Kent? So you took it upon yourself to skim from the sides of social circles, going to parties where you stood awkwardly against the walls, your long hair hiding your face, looking for drunk girls or drunk boys who were alone like you. You would stand close to them and feel their breath against your neck, goosebumps like defeathered chicken skin in the meat section of the supermarket. You would feel the breeze and feel yourself fly. And the second selection I will read from today, it's from a novel that I finished. It's actually, I'm submitting it out now. It's called Girl Interpreter. This is the first few paragraphs. The second the plane descends from the altitude of 30,000 feet, my body contracts. Stomach plummeting with each turbulent movement. I am going to die and think about the stories other will tell of me. Gone too soon, a virgin inexperienced. What a shame that she didn't get to live her potential. Not how anyone imagines arriving to America. With my insides falling apart, Papa tells me to pray instead of telling me a story to calm me down. That maybe if my soul says a bunch of Hail Marys, a miracle would happen and this terrible air sickness would stop. My mouth forms words, but the monster in my stomach shoves its way to my throat and the queasiness possesses me like those women filled with the Holy Spirit thrashing on the ground back home. I should have given you the Dramamine, Papa says for the 10th time since we left Ninoy Aquino International Airport in Manila. Papa already pocketed the hard granola bars, foil wrapped biscuits, and even the hard dinner rolls that me and Junior didn't eat during breakfast at 6 a.m. local time. The silverware too. He complains to the flight attendant and asks for more bags for me to throw up in since I have used mine, his and even Junior's vomit bags. Junior sleeps soundly on the other side of Papa, his legs akimbo. A white woman next to me turns to her young companion, shakes her head, and her disgust pierces through my nausea as she says, "Never have children." My ears pop and her companion's words blur. My eyes roll to the back of my head. The plane rocks from the turbulence of November winds, my entire being in sync with every movement. Can't you do something about your grandchild? The woman asks Papa. Papa apologizes to her, ashamed to say that this is not his grandchild, but his teenage daughter. Because how could he explain his silver hair to her and how he fathered his first child at the age of 50 and that she had done nothing but stir trouble? He tries to explain that I've been throwing up nonstop because he didn't give me Dramamine, how this is our first plane ride, how he should have known that this was like taking a long bus ride, only worse. How he would have given me Dramamine even as a 2-year-old to control the motion sickness, a sickness that made me a terrible travel companion, when what he needed was a good girl who never made a fuss. The white woman breaks a little and tells him about how she learned from a Chinese herbalist that ginger is good for motion sickness and that he should be giving me ginger instead. She mentions that the herbalist helped her with many health issues, explaining a little bit about hot and cold air in the body, the yin and yang. Aren't you Chinese? She asks him. Papa's tongue loosens and says yes, but not exactly Chinese. The woman furrows her brow. He tells her about how his parents moved from China to the Philippines, how he was born and left in the hospital for 2 years because his parents couldn't afford to have another mouth to feed. What a shame, the woman says, then asks him if we are coming for a visit. Papa pauses. It feels like the same question the man from the embassy asked us a few months before. He tells her the story we've all rehearsed before the interview to get our visas. That we're tourists visiting Ma, who's been in New York working as a nurse for the last 5 years. That we're going to see snow for the first time. That 5 years is long enough for a mother to see her family. What do you do? That woman asks. Business, Papa says. The little lies and the big lies all meld. He doesn't tell her about all the money he lost buying wholesale rice during the year when 3 Category 3 typhoons hit and flooded the rice fields and the stockrooms, and his partner ran off with the money to pay off the creditors. He doesn't tell her about the time when he tried to export wood carvings with an Australian man who left the country after the big earthquake, leaving him with giant carved wood rotting in storage. He doesn't tell her that he wants to start fresh in America. He doesn't tell her about the plan that his son and daughter will go to an American school and have American lives, or that although we bought round-trip tickets, this was a one-way journey. This is inside talk she doesn't need to hear. How long are you planning to stay? She asks. Our senses are on alert. Junior looks at Papa. Even in my state, I sense some danger and my head turns a little with my eyes closed. Papa slows down, careful not to give away too much, though he gave away so much already. No one needs to hear this kind of talk. The right words need to come out. Until the end of winter, he says, repeating the same rehearsed words we say to the man in the gray suit at the embassy who interviewed us as he shuffled his papers, looking at us each one by one, trying to gauge what was truth and what was not. Junior asked him then before the interview if it's all right to lie, and Papa says yes, when you have to. Here he is again, Papa on display, willing a heavily tinted truth to come out of his mouth. And I will read another selection, if that's okay. This one I started recently, and this is, I think, probably going to turn to a novel. So it's a ghost story, and I dedicate this to my father who had just passed away. It's called Famished. Before you left your body, the last flavor you remembered in your mouth was the chemical sweet taste of glucerna, because the diabetes prevented the doctors from giving you Ensure. Not that it matters. The liquid was all the same, both chemical milkshakes you used to give to patients at the nursing home, where you used to work, where you used to feel so sorry for residents like Mr. Steinberg, who lived through the Holocaust, and Mrs. Santiago, whose son got deported back to Ecuador, and you couldn't bear that all they had as dining options was Ensure or Glucerna, and you lived then for their gap-toothed smiles and thank you grins as you snuck milk cookies and Marie biscuits that you bought in bulk from the Russian store in Bensonhurst. You hated the smell of Ensure then, but you hated it even more now when you couldn't even swallow any thickened liquid because everyone was afraid that you would choke. Because you really would. This was before the PEG tube was inserted through your stomach to give you alternate nutrition. And that was when you could taste nothing except your old saliva and the mucus from your lungs as it got suctioned from you every few hours. Nobody knows hunger like the ones near death. Grasping, needling, begging. At the nursing home, giving treats to the residents, you, the self-appointed Santa Claus on the sly. Remember that? Better than being called a Chinaman. A Mao Zedong beloved by this class of forgotten people who knew that even in this country, full of selfish, greedy, bloated corpses that pose as the living, no one escapes this hunger. The same hunger you thought you escaped would hunt you down and bear its fangs, inevitable like the growth of your fingernails. Your brain was already giving your body signals to sleep and to forget and to stay unconscious. And where the mind goes, the body follows. All the bright lights and hard sounds in the hospital should have made it hard to sleep, but it didn't matter because you slept through it all. Even the patient screaming in the bed next to yours was already part of the dream nightmare you were experiencing. When you tried to speak, you couldn't get the words out anyway. Only a croaking gurgle left your throat. There was no water to loosen your tongue, and the scratchy noise your mouth tried to make was only an echo of a body broken, rumbling inside a tin can. When the ambulance took you to the nursing home, you remembered with a clear mind that you told your children never to take you to the nursing home. It didn't matter that they were crying as they said, I am sorry, I am sorry. Their intentions mattered little, even their tears. They took you to this vile place where hunger would continue to grab you by the neck, and you were already tired. Oh, so tired. In less than 12 hours when you died, you were alone, but you were also famished. And that is my reading for today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cherry, for that brilliant reading. It's a kind of incredible to see all the forms that your voice and your thinking is taking you, and I'm looking forward to speaking more. I'm very sorry there's a leaf blower going on outside, so I hope you can't hear that, but I am going to introduce our third reader, Yun Wei. After receiving her MFA in poetry from Brooklyn College in 2010, Yun Wei has published poetry and fiction in several journals. She's moved to Switzerland, and she is the proud recipient of 2 Moderna vaccines. Welcome, Yun Wei.
Thank you, Madeleine. I hope you can hear me. Just, well, first off, wow, Cherry and Jai, I'm not sure if I can follow you, but that was really inspiring. I will try, and really thank you for having me here. I do now live very far away, and this sort of brings me right back to Brooklyn College campus, and I think I see, hi, Julie. So it's just really nice to be back. Just really a privilege to be reading along with Cherry and Jai today. So I guess being invited to this reading, own struggles as with this identity of being an Asian American writer. And so I'll be sharing a few poems that I think reflect that. I just remember that when I was younger, I actually really resisted against writing about my Chinese background because I didn't want to be complicit in Orientalism. I didn't want to be boxed in as just, representing the immigrant experience. But then there have been other times where I've embraced that background, but then felt really unsure if I was representing that background authentically and fully. And, you know, to give you an example, I remember when I was doing my undergraduate at Georgetown, there was this annual cultural show where I had written a slam poem about love, just about, you know, the most universal theme you can find. And I was told by the organizers that it wasn't Asian enough for a show called Asia Fest. So then I wrote a second poem and performed that. And I heard that someone later complained, why does it always have to be about race? So it took me a really long time to realize that if I choose to cater to those perceptions, what it means is that I'm simplifying myself for people who can't understand complexity. So for this first poem, it's that I'm going to read. I was born during the one-child policy in China, and it was only in 2015 that having 2 children became possible. So this is for all of the second children who could have been born. Second child. The second child, a split world later, would have been the first. One matchstick finger on the scenery outside the window, wide open, no screens, before the day. The first to divine that the shape of plastic stars was based on a squint, how dresser drawers are filled with before and after, the future clothes she's supposed to grow into, and so, clenching her fists, she wills her limbs another inch. There is no mirror in the room, because she still thinks of herself as a landscape that fills and empties, changes borders like seasons, condenses to heavier forms, expands, dissolves, a body of water on fire. If she keeps burning, she'll be able to stretch to the open window and place a finger on the wet, wet scenery. Umbrella child, chance child, tomorrow. So with this next poem, I was thinking about, you know, there are a few things more solitary than writing. But if you think about the things that you want to change in the world, activism isn't possible in isolation. So I've actually found that poetry is this sort of unexpected way to be an activist, because what is poetry if not to create the language to speak about the unspeakable things? I wrote this poem at about 2 a.m. After March 16th, the Atlanta spa shootings. Stones between the toes, I walked, trying to hold my body in the shape of a canvas, a wind sail, trying hard not to look so breakable. Tomorrow, a man will buy a gun. 2 weeks ago, I was a konnichiwa. Tonight, my shoes say ni hao, too pretty for a Chinese. 8 blocks it takes me to shake him. He tells me it's a privilege to be wanted. I could be burned from head to stone and still they would call it desire. Tomorrow, a man will walk into a spa. Keys ready at the knuckles, I walked, feeling the hot stones in my pocket of 2 weeks, 1 year, 1,200 ago. From when there were Miram roads, lignite burned to soft coal, and still these streets are not mine. The thing with concrete is it doesn't dent. You don't have to ask what hurt me. Tomorrow, a man will kill 6 Asian women. The difference between a bullet and a chisel is time. No one will tell me when the night ends. Even the man I love doesn't know why I rage, Why I crush the things I should have said in my sedimentary mouth. Why I wreck everything just to leave a dent the length of a small key. Tomorrow, a man will be believed. Tomorrow, we dive through the wreckage, and the roads will be poured in, broken in, made of us. This next poem just came out in the latest issue of Shenandoah Journal. I tried to imagine what a hellscape would look like if it were made of flowers. It was our first great sorrow, and the flowers bloomed of violence. Sunflowers burned their heads off. Blue azaleas lit the match. What could be torn was torn. Sepals, filaments, and anthers split open, entrails hanging, every pistil ground down to the cellular level. Oh, what work it was, what work it took. From the windows of the labor ward, didn't we both see the magnolia trees shred their own petals, turning loss into small, delectable bites? Forget-me-nots, those skinny stem bitches, wandered around with an unconquerable thirst while purple mallows shivered for more. Oh, what work it was, what work it took. My father told me when I was born, there was a light that was unreadable, like the smallest book in the world. That day, the daisies sharpened their knives. The poppies, seasonal, bloodied their toes, trying to kick down the perennial vines, the wisterias and honeysuckles and dark ivies, but they couldn't stop the branching, the incessant multiplying and dividing, any more than they could stop grief from splintering out of love. What work it was to say her name, what work it took to unhold her. So this last poem, I guess, reflects another part of my identity. I'm an economist by day, and I wanted to see if I could write a love poem using macroeconomic vocabulary. This is for my husband, Mike, who gets way too many poems written about him than he could ever want. It's just the perils of dating a writer, I think. So sorry, Mike. An economic theory of love. There are econometrics to explain this. The feeling of loss as soon as I've had you. You encircled my wrist between 2nd Avenue coasters and salted tables, spinning to a quick compression that had the air of recklessness. 11 years, now a fixed variable. An archaic hunger turning all variations of the slope into me folding over you, yours over mine. No one tells you equilibriums are a cruel narrowing. Do you love me? A categorical answer. We always forget our anniversary, like the time we were in Tokyo, decomposing the night to small plates, thick jokes, in the gaps of whiskey alleys until we went broke. Say something. If I think of another man, they are only variations of the unsaid. Then it is the back of your neck over fried eggs. On the mornings, endogenous pecks are all I can give. Clouds of residuals too scattered to be significant. Don't ask me for proof of loss, of sated, of fragility only measured after the breaking. When I already know the slope of your shoulders reminds me of rooftops. Let me watch from here a little longer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yun. It was a searing reading. I'm so happy that we had the chance to talk to all three of you now. What I was thinking, if you're in a quiet place, I'm going to kind of be muting and unmuting because there's a bit of noise outside. But if the three of you want to unmute so you're able to speak more freely between each other, please feel free if that feels right. And just for the audience, as I understand it, I believe there are a number of students from the undergraduate creative writing program, as well as some of our MFA students as well. And I just really want to encourage you to take the opportunity to ask any questions that you have about the writing life, about form, craft, about identity, about the ways that their writing is grappling with different questions. Please feel free in the chat or to use the raise hand function. And just to give everyone time to put together questions, I wanted to actually bring you back in time a bit and ask you, all three of you, to speak a bit about that period of time when you made the decision to put in the application for the MFA program. We're very lucky because you graduated in quite a span of time, 2010, 2013, and 2019, kind of a transformative decade. And I wondered if you could go back to that period of time and what you were hoping to find by writing in community.
Should we go chronologically? I'll be last.
Oh, wow, that means I'm the oldest, I guess. I guess I can start. I don't know, I was in this, I don't know, I think, Jai, you've spoken before about like non-linear careers. And at the time I was working in finance as an analyst, and I realized that I needed something for my soul, and it was something that I had always wanted to do. I think, you know, the stereotype of Asian parents is that they want you to have a real career. And I remember wanting to major in literature when I went to undergraduate, but my parents convinced me that, you know, you should study international relations and economics, which I'm very glad that I did. But I think it was a moment when I was in New York, and I knew that this was something that I had always wanted to do. I guess the motivation was there. But when I was looking at the different programs, like in New York, I thought really the Brooklyn College one had that sort of community, like the one-on-one kind of work of really digging deep. And I knew that, I mean, I didn't know how much I would gain, exactly how much I would gain, but I had a sense that it was going to absolutely sharpen my editing and make myself really almost brutally objective with my own work. And I think that's what I really needed. And I was also just, you know, excited to meet other writers and to be pushed in different directions that I would have never sort of gone to if I was just sort of sitting there myself.
I guess I'm next in the chronological order. So, you know, when I came to New York, I fell in with a group of poets, and I felt like I had this wonderful education into poetry, which was unofficial, which was not from the perspective of an MFA. And I felt like I really got to deepen there into the lyric verse. And yet I had been someone who had loved short stories since I was a kid. And I felt that calling return when I was, you know, sort of in my mid or late 20s, I guess. And so that's when I realized that I wanted to really go deeply into the craft of fiction. And little did I know, and I think he's in the audience today, that Joshua Henkin is someone who is willing to and able to demystify the craft of fiction. So I was completely lucky in that way to be able to study with somebody who's willing to demystify the craft of fiction in the way in which so many of my poetry community had done that. And of course, as Yun said, for me, it was also really important to be part of community and to do this learning with others. And so I'm still part of a writing group from my Brooklyn College crew. So that's extremely meaningful to me, and to be able to grow as writers in community is really important.
Okay, not last but not least, I, like Yun and Jai, I was also looking for community, always looking for community ever since I can remember. I am the weird child. I freely admit that. And growing up, I was always sort of the odd man out, etc. And I applied to the playwriting program because at that point, I didn't think that I could do fiction, because even though I love plays, theater and fiction equally, fiction, I was in classes where I had some toxic experiences, which I will not recount right now, but they were super toxic, and it made me quit writing fiction for a while. And then I remembered that I wanted to be in my body more, that I wanted to experience joy of community through interaction. And that really made me think about, okay, maybe I can be a playwright, because at one point I thought I would also be an actress, but then I shifted to writing plays instead. And then that time I met Mac Wellman. I had a conversation with him, and then he kept emailing me and saying, are you applying to the program? So I did apply, and then I got a scholarship, and so I applied, and since then I have found community, not just in the playwriting program, but also with the fiction program. I was part of the the review, so I was also part of the editorial board, so I was always talking to the poetry people, also with the fiction people, and that was great. And then I tried to cross-pollinate also and take classes that were not just with playwrights, but with the poets and the fiction writers, because I also believe in diversity in the ecosystem. So that was something that I really leaned into, and I appreciated my time with my cohort, as challenging as some of it may have been. Also, I appreciated my time with Erin Courtney and Mac Wellman.
There's questions coming in. I'm just going to ask one more. I'm thinking a lot about Lisa Lowe's groundbreaking work, and I'm thinking about all of our sort of different experiences across time. And I notice in listening to you read and thinking about your work that you're always moving across different geographies. You're putting the exposures of things over top of each other. There's so many, sometimes languages, histories, sometimes and bound histories that you're kind of putting in side by side and alongside each other together. And so my question is a little bit complicated, which is that I'm thinking of something I think that Yun was talking about activism and solitude and writing. And that our writing vocations, even the four of us, are happening across different times. I mean, I think when I did my MFA, I never worked with an Asian professor. I never worked with an Asian writer, faculty member. I've never worked with an Asian editor. And I can see that things are changing very quickly, but I am kind of interested in that feeling, sometimes in workshops, sometimes in the writing world, sometimes in our own grappling with histories we haven't seen brought together in a way we imagine, about that feeling of loneliness and how you're each sort of working with that and writing as a form of address to others. It's always in that conversation.
Oh, I thought we were going to go the other order around now. I was waiting for I
could have said that, you would have taken the pressure off, but you can start.
Sure. I no fully formed thoughts, but I guess I can start. Yeah, I mean, it's the loneliness of it. I think also that maybe this relates to the previous question, sort of growing up, who did we have to sort of look up to, before we decided to become writers. And I just remember having an immediate, Amy Tan was like the first well-known writer on the scene. And I was so excited about her. And I felt this great connection because I felt less lonely. But then as I read more of her work, I started, questioning actually what that was representing. And, was it exoticizing parts of my culture? And then I had to look wider. And it was through school that I discovered Maxine Hong Kingston and other authors. And I think each of those connections just do make you feel less lonely. And I think Borges was the one who said that, poetry doesn't happen, when you've written it. It happens when the reader meets the page. That's the moment that poetry happens. So I think it takes a lot of solitude to make observations on the world with some distance and to be able to try to look at things objectively and to articulate the difficult things to articulate about our world. So I think it takes solitude to create that. But I think ultimately, we want that connection with people and that understanding so that we can also change their minds and help them experience something different. So I have no idea if that answered your question, but to me, it's sort of that balance of having enough solitude to look at the world objectively, but then be connected enough to so that that poetry happens at that moment between the reader and what's written.
What a lyrical answer, Yun. I'm thinking about the fact that as a South Asian writer, so many of the folks that I was growing up reading, it seemed that they needed to include references to India, like mangoes and monkeys, and that there needed to be some aspect of magical realism in order for that work to be published. At least that's what it seemed to me on the surface of things. And then Jhumpa Lahiri came along and kind of we transitioned out of this scope of mangoes and monkeys toward a Munro-like realism. And I think that has felt perhaps even a bit imprisoning to Jhumpa Lahiri herself, which is perhaps why she wrote in Italian to get out of that world. But what has helped me through these different vantage points of publishing is to look for authors at the margins. And this includes authors who are writing in my native language, which is Bengali, because I think there is absolutely a real potential of loneliness when we are looking at authors who are only being published in this moment by, let's say, the big 5 publishers in this country. But when we look at the margins, there's always an incredible diversity of voices. And in the times when I've found myself feeling a little bit alienated by what I'm reading, it means that I'm perhaps not reading enough at the margins. And that's when I start to connect more and feel that sense of community.
Oh gosh, you both have such great, I'm going to quote you, Jai, lyrical answers. Yeah, I agree too with what you're both saying about who are the literary ancestors, and for me, it's just it's just hard. I think about this a lot, especially because right now I'm also an adjunct in the English department in the American Studies department. And this semester I tasked myself to teach I believe, I'm not sure, I believe it's the first intro to the Asian Pacific American studies through literature. And so I'm thinking about lineage, I'm thinking about that a lot. I'm thinking a lot about, patterns of migration. I am thinking, oh yes, Ellen Trumper, Professor Trumper is the head of the English department. She concurs, it is, so it is the first. And I know that it's hard for me to disengage from just the aesthetic form and craft of the thing, poetry, playwriting, and fiction, nonfiction, all of this, and all the prosaic forms, because as a person of color in the margins, the experience doesn't necessarily have form. What I've witnessed and experienced growing up in this country as a teenager was that whatever was packaged as, and this is Asian American, and this is Chinese American, and this is what, it is all neat and in a box. This is Amy Tan, as you said, Yun. That was, I just remember in high school, everybody was shoving Amy Tan down my throat, and nothing wrong with her, but it's a certain type of leaning, I'll call it that way. It's a certain type of leaning, and great, but it does not necessarily represent a lot of experiences that I know, or even mine, and so that was interesting for me. And it wasn't until I became serious to pursue writing, or just being an artist in general, that this knowledge, that you have to advocate for yourself. And this is where the activism comes in. You have to advocate for yourself. You have to advocate for voices, not exactly not exactly yours maybe, but similar to yours, or similar to the people who if you lean in a little bit, that again, it's sort of within the framework of the experiences that So I just think about how, as an artist and trying to get into the world, I mean, it's the same in theater, it's the same. I don't know about poetry so much, but I know fiction, it's similar. In theater, it's similar, because there can only be one, and are you the one voice that the mainstream crowd has crowned, you are the one, you are the one, you are the one, and then if you diverge from that, suddenly people scratch their heads and say, oh, but this is not Asian American, or this is not this kind of thing, this is not this kind of thing, and I really credit my seeing of things also with a lot of Black artists, because they have paved the way. I mean, I just think about like Octavia Butler, for example, where she was told that this is not going to happen, that's not going to happen, and I just think about that, a piece of paper on, her notebook, where she says, I am going to be a best-selling author, I am going to be this and that, so she did speculative fiction that, like, to her life, and so I really admire that. And I just think about the people who have helped me, throughout the years, and a lot of them, pointed me to these voices, right? But then also to think about, well, what does it mean to have a speculation of yourself as your own voice, right? And I see that for Asian American, Asian, or AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islanders. What does that mean? Because we are constantly invisible, in the margins. That line you had earlier, Yun, about I wrote it down 2 weeks ago. I was a konnichiwa. That totally encapsulates my experience too. Or I remember just being chased down the street and people constantly invoking an identity on me, you know? And so what does that mean? And constantly thinking about that. I'm sorry, I'm kind of babbling, but one book I do recommend, or I have, oh no, it's downstairs. Matthew Salace's Craft in the Real World. So it was just published this year. And that talks about craft in a way that I have not read craft being talked about before, and that craft is partly an aesthetic, you know, it is not neutral. So that was a very powerful claim for me, you know. So yeah, I and to sum up, I do see that if you want to be a writer, if you want to be an advocate for writing for artists, you have to be able to advocate for the right of that voice to exist. And I'll end with that.
Thank you, all of you. I want to go to some of the questions that have come in on the chat too. There's one from Lisa Lowe and from Julie. And I'll start with Lisa's because it seems to follow from what you've been saying. She says, what a beautiful set of readings. Your works are very different and you write in different genres, yet all the pieces are so fearless and moving. Can you speak about your influences, whether poets, fiction, or people in your life? And I just want to add just a note that what's fascinating to me is seeing all of you, I mean, I think pretty much writing in different forms post MFA too. I mean, it feels like you're pushing the boundaries of the craft that you have into new spaces in order to sort of get at those unspoken things you've been talking about, and to find other ways to bring them into a perceptive space. Should we start with Jai? I feel like I should give an order.
Sure, the middle child, as it were. So I want to call out and say, I think, you know, for this book in particular, Ellen Tremper was an influence for me because we got to study with her, a group of 4 of us, and read Ulysses together. What a privilege to do that in such a small, intimate group with someone who studied that book and knows it so deeply, backwards and forwards and in every way. And for some other influences for me for this book, Jhumpa Lahiri's The Lowland, which is about the backdrop of the Naxalite Revolution, which is also something that figures in my book. The poetry of Paul Celan comes to mind. And so many writers who are exploring memory and trauma and what it means to move through life with both of those things, and to still have a perspective on living in the moment. But those are a couple that I'll just call out there.
I guess I can go next, although I kind of wanted to continue with the previous question what Cherry and Jai was saying, but maybe I'll come back to that. So many influences. I also write fiction as well, and I always have to read poetry before I write fiction, because I find it helps me access the language and then the voice like very quickly, and I have I feel like a wider field of vocabulary when I read poetry before. So right now, I mean, I have a lot of obsessions right now, but Natalie Diaz is probably at the top there. Just, you know, stunning. And in terms of fiction writers, I can say that I guess being a poet, I do love the lyrical language, but James Baldwin and Jasmine Ward have been some of my obsessions lately. Just, you know, they write so beautifully, but about really terrible things, and about violence, and about poverty, and about discrimination, but yet it absolutely soars, and it doesn't, I think it doesn't reduce in any way that the power of those experiences. And then in terms of, I would say, activism poetry, probably Adrienne Rich was the one who got me started on that. I guess maybe the one addendum to the previous question, I just, Cherry, what you were saying, because we're creating within certain structures, right? And I do, wonder if even just the word representation is just automatically a box, because as you said, it means that there is one representation which within an overall structure, and once that's done, it's done. And it's as if like we didn't need anymore. So I just kind of an interesting point that I've been from the previous one. Thanks.
Yeah, I agree. Natalie Diaz is amazing. And I feel like I still am unearthing all the ancestral stories. When I say ancestors, some of them were like from 5 years ago, So just because they're making such an impact in the landscape, I think about that a lot too. And then I think about those who have been lost in the shuffle because they were not the chosen ones, like in my class right now, we read selections from, Young Hil Kang, and then who was the first Asian Korean American, novelist. And I had never heard of his book before, like in college or whatever. It was only in the last 2 years, I think, that I had heard about him. And we also read No No Boy, and I think about, who do we think of as the canon? So I think about these a lot. I think about lineage. I think about legacy. I think about canon a lot. Yes, James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, love them. I love, right now, I think about Kathy Park Hong's work in Minor Feelings. I recommend that to everyone if you haven't gotten a chance to read that. I've also really been influenced by Keisei Lehmann's work, especially his memoir, Heavy. I think about that a lot. And my friend, Kimberly Nguyen, who passed away last year, she was such a brilliant writer. And I think about this a lot, whether if you are, because she has published short stories, but she passed before her novel could be even completed, and I think a lot about how I learned so much from her, as a writer. And yet, because of her untimely demise, she's Cambodian American. And I also think about Anthony Visnaso. They were kind of in this network, I kind of knew him a little bit through her. And it was such a torment to lose both strong voices, and the difference to me was so palpable when, I learned about him dying right after she passed, because they passed away in the same year. But he had a body of work that was already out in, publication, became a New York Times bestseller after parties. And my friend did not and does not, and I think about that a lot. So because they are not, or at least my friend, for example, she's not in the canon, although she could have been, does that mean that her impact is any less than, let's say, Anthony? So I think about these things a lot. And so and it's not just here, in my American Studies class, I had them, because I also go into visual art a lot, and there's this artist, Black artist, his name is Titus Kaphar. And I love the work that he does, because what he does is that he takes a lot of Renaissance paintings and he repaints them exactly as how they were painted by the masters. And then he puts paint over them. But over time, that paint sort of removes itself, so that he's making a statement about erasure, So I'm learning also from various artists, not just in the literary form, but in the visual form, because what is the voice that they are kind of pushing? What are they saying? And I think about how there was a story that he had. He has a TED Talk there's a story that he had that when he was in college, he took an art class to impress a girl. And then in that art history class, it's a big book, like 500 pages. There were 14 pages about Black artists. And then the professor decided not to go over the 14 pages. And he asked the professor, could you not go over this? And the professor said, no, I don't have time for that. So that made an impact on him about who Black artists are in the canon of white visual art. And so that also made an impression on me, knowing that there was an artist like that, knowing that he was also advocating for Black art, and then the subject matter that he was talking about, because one of the things that he had said was that he could find in art history books more information about the jewelry that people, or the clothing that people were wearing, than the Black person who was painted in the painting, and that was such a powerful analogy for me, that as we're Asian American, and the form that we're creating in Asian American literature, it's fairly new, if we compare it to other types of literature. And I'm constantly asking, well, yeah, who are the ancestors? Where is our lineage? Especially because we have so many regional divides. Who claims Asian American literature and the like? So these are the things that I'm thinking about in my own work. What is the legacy?
Thank you. There's one last question. It's actually a great question from Julie that I want to also put in. It might be our last, unless something is just coming. Yes. I'm just going to scroll up and find Julie's question. Sorry, everyone. Yes. Julie writes, listening to you, and I was thinking about the way that love, rage, and play cohabit in the poems, both thematically but also formally, and in the rules for the poem's procedure. Could I ask each of you to talk a bit about how the love of writing and the play involved meet the difficulty of composition and figuring out how to proceed, and of unpacking the content and feelings? And I just want to add a thought to that. As I've been listening to each of you speak, I definitely feel with this rising generation of writers, a tension between the representation, the political, the act, the thinking about how literature functions in the world, but alongside the artist's love of language or form, or grappling with form and play and the possibilities of language. And it's really in my mind, because on Friday I interviewed the Palestinian writer Adania Shibli, and her novel has been called, among many, many things, the political novel of our time. But she was very firm that she wanted to talk about what the language is doing, what the language makes possible, and what the language is showing us, that not that it is not political, but that it rearranges in so many ways how we think about the political. So I think Julie's question is a great one to maybe end on. Should I invite someone to start? I'm actually wondering, Yun, if you could start, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. I mean, it's just such great questions, and I feel like questions that I think about every time I create. I guess, I don't know, I have a rule of the first draft is for me and the second draft is for everyone else. So I think just that, that initial act of creation, I definitely try to zone out what perceptions might come through. Obviously, I'm creating within a
Oh, if everyone is wondering about her connection, she's in Switzerland, so I don't think.
Oh, you can't hear me right now?
It just blipped out for like maybe 3 seconds or so.
Oh gosh, okay. Well, I'll assume you got that, the previous. Yeah, just that the second draft is where I start thinking about how the reader experiences it, and where I start actually really dissecting like the initial emotions and, you know, the initial impulse, I guess, and examining what exactly I was trying to say, even if I consciously was not aware of what I was trying to say. And there are times where I realize I was actually really trying to put forward a political message, or I was really trying to make a commentary, you know, about, I don't know, economic class. And but that's something that doesn't happen until after that first, I guess, moment. I think that sort of answers Julie's question, but I think Madeleine, your question is around that, the political space that we exist in. And I mean, taking poetry, for example, there is this tension, you know, poetry tends to be very open-ended. And I think literary fiction tends to also be rather open-ended, where we don't consider, you know, clear-cut stories literary. That's like in the thriller department or something, because it's reflecting that, you know, there are no easy answers in life. But to me, the tension is that, you know, to be politically active and to observe the world, we have to be incredibly specific, and we have to be willing to put words to things that we're observing in the world that are not right, that we want to change. And so I do find that tension in the writing, where I want to leave enough space, you know, for the interpretation, the experience of the reader. But when we think about, you know, what's going on in the world, I think we also can't shy away from using the words of what it really means, instead of wrapping it up in a metaphor.
Yeah, and such a profound question. And everything you said, Yun, resonates with me. I'm thinking about the fact that in Indian aesthetics, there's this term called Leela, which is this idea of a kind of divine play with your artistic work, which is to say that the pursuit of, let's say, a first draft in this case, is the pursuit in some cases of an unexpected spiritual awakening, which certainly raises the stakes for entering into a first draft. But I think that sense that the unexpected can come, I think that's only possible through a sense of openness toward play, which I really connect with and relate to. And I think about the fact that, again, going back to Indian aesthetics, you have Panini, who develops a structure for then thinking about language, who develops a new language to then think about the existing language of Sanskrit. And so for me, revision is that process, which is to say that it's another way to think about the creative process, which is not the creative process itself, that allows the writer to create a degree of safe space by which we can go back and actually engage with the text, but in a different relationship than the one in which we originally engaged with the text when we were entering it in the first draft space.
So with this question, I immediately thought about Audrey Lorde. There's this essay that she had written, "Poetry is Not a Luxury." And I really resonate with that a lot. You know, especially this idea that the body has so much knowledge and wisdom, and that it's through the body and not, you know, not the intellect where we find the words, basically, you know. And so I think about that a lot, because I think about the way how I work as well. I do work, I don't know if it's reactive, but I definitely engage through my senses, and that's likely because of my theater training, but I approach writing that way as well. So I think once upon a time I was very, you know, intellectual, and my literary heroes, when I used to just think about my brain all the time, was probably you know, all the postmodern people, you know. So all the long lavish sentences pages and pages, no commas, and things like that. But since I shifted and thought about, well, what is my body telling me right now to write? How am I viewing this world? It changed my practice a lot.
That seems a very powerful note to end on, and I can't believe the time ran out so quickly. I just want to thank you three for your readings, for your thinking, for everything you've asked us to think about, and it's been an honor to have this conversation with you, and I wish you all the very, very best going forward with your writing, and we'll see you hopefully in person at the college at some point in the near future. Does anyone need to come back on, or do I do the wrap? Okay, so it's my honor to just thank everyone for being here, and we'll see you at the continuing events this week with Lisa Lowe. And Lisa, amazing to see you. Can't wait to see to continue this conversation this week. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.